Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Kathleen O'Leary. I am the Deputy Commissioner for the Montana Department of Labor and Industry. I want to welcome all of you and thank you for joining us this afternoon to another one of our town halls. These town halls were something that we started near the beginning of the pandemic. I believe it was the beginning of April when we had our first one. To be used as a forum to answer and field the many questions and inquiries that we were getting from employers across the state. And so for a while we were doing them weekly, and they proved to be really an effective way of communicating out to all regions of our state. So we've continued them. We're not doing them weekly, more monthly now, but I'm really excited to have you here today. This is our second quarterly economic update. The first one was well attended and well received, so we've decided to do these quarterly going forward. So just some housekeeping details for those of you that are new to this forum. We do have a chat. I encourage all of you, if you have any questions, to use our chat box. If we have time near the end, we will circle back around and try to answer your questions. If we don't have the information or the answer to the questions or time to address it, we will circle back around at our next town hall and get you the information you're looking for. In addition to that, please use our chat box if you're interested in participating or signing in to future town halls. If you want to put your contact information, your email address in the chat box, we will make sure and include you on the invite list as we are scheduling out future ones. Besides that, these are recorded. We place them on our website for anyone who wants to go back and use them as reference. And I believe Rebecca will put the website link in the chat box for all of you to use as reference later. All right, with that, I'm going to have Barb introduce herself, explain to everyone why she's such an expert and such an awesome resource for the state of Montana. And then, Barb, if you want to jump right into your presentation, I will interject occasionally with questions, and then we'll do a recap at the end. So, Barb, take it away.
Thanks, Kathleen. My name is Barb Wagner. I'm the Chief Economist here at the Department of Labor. I've been here for quite a few years. I think I started here at the department in 2008, and happy to love being able to share my passion about the economy from the state that I was born and raised in, so that makes it a very good position for me. I guess I'll get started. I think as we're approaching 2021, everyone seems to be hoping for greater optimism in the next year. And I think that is true from an economic viewpoint as well. It's been quite a ride in 2020. But there's all sorts of optimistic signs for an end to coming to this pandemic. We've got vaccines that are already being distributed into Montana. Most people, or some of the experts, are thinking that those vaccines will become more widely available by this summer. And once the vaccines are widely distributed, we can start finally getting the last bit of our economy fully reopened, which will allow like the leisure activities, the tourism, the restaurants to fully recover at that point. So we're way ahead of the timelines that we thought we were going to be on with that vaccine. And you know, I think there's a lot of optimism to look forward to in the next coming year. And our economy has been, throughout this past year, recovering quite quickly, so that's good news as well. So with that bout of optimism, we start then looking at the economic data, and, you know, economists are always told that they have, you know, on one hand, we're optimistic, on the other hand, here's the bad news. Well, you know, there's actually both good news and bad news when we start looking at the actual data. This screen shows Montana's labor force and employment data over the last year. You can see the very sharp declines we had in April during the business shutdown. Over the next 2 months, very strong recovery in both employment and a good recovery in the labor force. And then like a slower recovery since that point in total employment and payroll employment. Now we're going to take this data and we're going to index it right here on the next slide. So what does that mean? That means that we take the February number, which is the pre-recession peak, and we put it at 100%, and then any fall down from that point is a percentage change in employment or labor force. And what that does is it puts all three of these metrics on the same chart, and we can look at the performance and how close we are to 100% just a little bit easier. So that's the benefit of indexing these charts. And looking at this, one of the really good news that we have going into 2021, we are almost fully recovered for our labor force participation. That's very good news. This is October data is the last we have available. We will be releasing the November data on Friday. And with that, we're already just in October very close to 100%. For our labor force, and that's very good news. Our labor force has not been as impacted as it has been nationally, and that's good news for our future economic growth. What that means is that there are workers out there looking for work and interested in working, so when those jobs become available, they'll be able to quickly move into employment. So that's a very positive metric right there. And then the other two, our total employment has done a great job of recovering. We're still down about 9,000 jobs and at 98% of our pre-recession peak in February. Our payroll employment has not made as strong of a recovery as our total employment. And that's a kind of an interesting part about this recession. What's the difference between those two? I believe, and not that one. So the difference between payroll employment and total employment tends to be the self-employed. I think I have another little box on that. So one thing I wanted to mention about the labor force is that you see right here during the summer months, we did have a little decline in the labor force. And that is when a lot of parents had to take time off work in order to take care of their children during the summer months when there wasn't as many camps and other things that are usually going on in the summer. Since school started, that seems to have resolved a little bit, but I do think we all still have a lot of parents out there who are juggling work, and they would be included in these employed numbers and these labor force numbers, even if they're still working part-time. So I think that will also be an issue in the next year. As daycare availability becomes more available, those parents will be able to move into full-time employment instead of having to juggle with making things meet and working late nights and stuff. Okay, so now we're caught up. The difference between total employment and payroll employment is the self-employed mostly. Payroll employment is those who kind of pay into the UI system. They get paid on an hourly or quarterly basis. Those total employment also includes business owners, the self-employed, and why we do normally during recessions see a lot of people who lose their payroll jobs. They take that opportunity to start their own business and move into self-employment. So that's one reason why total employment may be recovering faster than payroll. But there might be some other issues going on here. There's some small differences in how we collect data between the two methods. And as we get more data in, we might have some more understanding about that. It's also interesting if, teleworkers, we've heard rumors about teleworkers moving to Montana with their jobs. If that is happening, which it's hard to measure that, we would see those individuals be included in the total employment number because they're a person who is working within the state of Montana, but we would not see that job in our payroll jobs because that's still associated with their home office in wherever they came from that office that they're now working remotely from. So that could be part of this difference as well. It's really kind of hard to tell at this point where those differences are coming from. So that's something that we'll be looking forward to learning more about in the next year. So there has been a lot of, certainly Montana is doing pretty well. We're one of the fastest states in the nation in terms of this recovery. The U.S. has not been as quick in their recovery as the United States. And this chart kind of illustrates that. Again, we're using the same colors for the labor force is gray, and then the total employment is purple, but the U.S. is shown by the dotted lines, while Montana remains as a solid line. So basically the same chart as the last one, but we're taking away payroll employment and we're adding in the U.S. labor force and employment levels. And you can see that the U.S. is still down about 6% in October, and their labor force has not had that same recovery that the Montana labor force has had. They're still down they have come up from the 5% down that they were at during April, but there still is a lot of workers missing from the U.S. labor force. So Montana is doing much better than the nation in terms of our recovery. We're currently ranked number 5 for the best performance throughout the COVID recession. We're tracking this metric on our jobs tracking dashboard. I'm not going to show the job tracking dashboard this presentation because the last town hall, we covered a lot of it. But if you weren't able to check that out last time, you can find the job tracking dashboard at this web address right here. There's all sorts of information available on that, and you'll see some of the slides from the dashboard throughout this presentation. State by state, I mentioned we're among the 5 best, and this chart is kind of showing that graphic for each and every single individual state. And you do see some patterns here. Up in the upper Midwest, states did not seem to have as large of a fall. Part of that is a more rural nature. A lot more of our we have a lower share of our employment in some of those things like restaurants and services that were most particularly hard hit. The scale here is that those that are the most red are the largest amount of jobs lost, California being the worst with over 1 million jobs still down. That's quite a lot. And then it moves into blue, but no one is quite blue yet. Alaska is the only one that is in the positive side, and they're up slightly as of October. And this is all seasonally adjusted data. And then Montana within the top 5 of that. So one of the conversations that has been happening within the media is about whether or not the recovery is slowing down. And the answer to that question is a little bit more complicated. Yes, it is slowing down, but it's also still faster than we've ever had an economic recovery before. So we need to put that in context. This chart, it's a little bit confusing, but again, we're looking at indexed employment, where 100% is the pre-recession level of employment. And then where the 0 is where the lowest point of the recession was. So every single trough from the past recessions going back to 1980 are plotted on this chart with the very lowest point, the trough, at the 0 mark. So we can then see how many months it took to get to the lowest point. And then from that lowest point, how many months did it take for us to get back to 100%? And this is all Montana employment data. And you can see a couple of things are pretty obvious on this chart. First of all, both the 2008 recession and the current COVID recession were significantly deeper than our recessions in the past, which were, 1 or 2 percentage points. Unprecedented levels of employment losses during April, but there's also an unprecedented return to employment growth in the current recession as well. Soon as the businesses reopened, we regained a lot of those job losses. You also see the very slow recovery and the pace of recovery, even in some of these smaller recessions that were prior to 2008. The pace of recovery is really slow. The slope of those lines is a lot more flat than the current recession. The current recession, we're regaining jobs so quickly. Looking at these in terms of numbers and not graphically, if we took the average of every single recession from 1980 to 2008, the average job gain per month in a recovery is about 400 per month. In 2008, we gained about 480 per month. And it took us a long time, 45 months to get back to our level. Well, this recession, we've been having very, very strong recovery. And our job growth per month since the trough in April has been 8,580 jobs per month. That's insane, right? Like last recession, we're talking about around 500. This one, we're talking about 8,580. That's a lot of jobs to add per month. Even if you take out these 2 months where we like really gain jobs back quickly and just look at the last 2 months where we're slow recovery, we're still gaining 3,800 jobs per month. So around 4,000 jobs. And that is a lot of jobs that we're adding. We usually add, like I think in 2018, we added about 8,000 jobs over the entire year. So to have that gained in 2 months is a very, very rapid pace of growth. So
I have a couple questions for you, Rob. Go ahead, finish your thought.
My point here is, the point of this chart is that yes, the recovery is slowing down, but it's slowing down from like warp speed and we're still at Mach 10. So it is, the pace of recovery is still doing it's a strong recovery and we're still looking pretty positive in the state of Montana.
All right, perfect. So when you are talking jobs here, Barb, are those full-time jobs or part-time jobs?
Oh, excellent question. So these employment statistics do not necessarily distinguish between a full-time or a part-time job. If you're working and getting any sort of employment, then you're considered employed, both as a payroll and in total employment numbers. We do track the hours worked particularly for payroll jobs, and it has not changed as much as you would think during the last year. I actually think as we get more data in, those estimates will become more, will probably show a little bit more fluctuation in the hours worked. So we do have that data. I think what really you see during this recession is the people who are able to work from home, and a lot of the people in the most of the economy that were in essential industries or industries that have been able to reopen, they've come back with full-time jobs just like we were before. I think the lacking jobs are still within those industries that have not been able to reopen, or within tourism where we're just not getting the demand for that type of service. And so those, if they come back, they're part-time and they're just still missing is really the answer on that.
Perfect, thank you.
So I compared to the US in a previous chart, but I wanted to show you this chart and how the US is comparing during this recovery as well. Looking at the timeline of a full recovery, the US lost a lot more employment during this COVID recession than Montana did. They came down to 84% of their previous total. We were only at 88%. That's still a huge loss, certainly. We don't want to minimize the amount of damage that the pandemic caused within the state, but certainly the US has had a harder impact than the Montana. And then there's just been a couple of months here where the US did not have a very strong growth, whereas Montana continues to push forward. So that's what that looks like with the US. I think Montana will hit a full recovery earlier than the US. And that tends to be Montana's, if you look at prior recessions, our economy tends to be more stable overall than the US, which means that we don't fall as much. We also typically don't have growth as high during the huge expansions as well. But in some ways, that's a positive thing. Ideally, you want your economy to just continue to grow every year at a nice steady pace. So that is a positive for the Montana recovery. Looking at expectations moving forward, I wanted to show you a couple of things, and I just provided some expectations for the Montana economy. Now, let's say what we would be if we were super optimistic. If we were super optimistic and we said, hey, the economy is going to continue to grow, and again, remember that this data is just through October. So in September and October, we added the 3,800 jobs per month, right? If we continued to add 3,800 jobs in November, December, and January 2021, we would be back to even in January 2021. That's how fast it's been. I don't think we're going to get there. Like, I think that's a little too optimistic. At the end of this year, we have a lot of this federal stimulus expiring. There is still remaining issues with the COVID. There's increasing case counts for COVID. There's a lot of reasons to think that that's not going to happen. So what is a more realistic output? If we took the average growth, so let's take that 480 that we had last recession and in previous recessions, that's what it would look like here. I did say that during the summer, when we get the COVID vaccine widely, we're start to see some restaurants reopen, and I did add a little bit of job growth this summer for that restaurant reopening. But in that case, we're looking at the end of 2021. If it's slower, it would be 2022, but I actually think this is a pretty realistic expectation for our recovery, assuming that the vaccine distribution continues to go as planned, and there isn't something like, a worst case scenario would be that the COVID mutates in some way, and then the vaccine would have to get reproduced. Not including those worst case scenarios, this seems to be a pretty reasonable expectation, which gets us back to even at the end of next year. So we'll see how that goes. I'm now on record.
Yeah.
We'll talk next year whether or not I was right.
We'll talk next quarter. See how we do that next quarter.
Yeah, I certainly don't think we can expect the pace of the recovery to continue the way it has been. There's a number of reasons to think that's not going to happen. We've lost a lot of the stimulus dollars now, which is going to be huge. We'll talk about that a little bit more. And there's just some people who will not be able to get to work until we can fully reopen. And that requires our case counts to be much, much lower than they are right now. So looking at this again, I said that we'd talk a little bit about stimulus. So here we are back on the same chart that you guys have already seen. And of course, you totally understand indexing now. So it's not confusing at all. I wanted to add something here of when our extra stimulus payments were going out for unemployment insurance. Now we had from April until July 25th, a $600 payment stimulus. And then after that, we had a little break. And then we had the $400 additional in August. We're also doing it in December, but again, our data ends in October, so we got to live with what we've got. And one thing I wanted to point out is that there are, like, the times that we're not providing unemployment insurance during those months that we do have data for. And of course, this is not enough data to actually make this conclusion. However, it does seem that the unemployment insurance benefits are have caused a lot more payroll job growth particularly, but that has really spurred growth. We see growth dropping off almost instantly when we lost the $400 payments after September. And that is consistent with what we would expect for economic theory. So, as an economist, I'm very happy that it's working the way we think it should. But I want to stress that, again, as we look forward and not having these additional UI payments in the future, that probably will result in slower growth, particularly for the payroll employment seems to be more sensitive to that. Just to divert a little bit into what we want for a fiscal stimulus, conceptually, economic theory thinks that fiscal stimulus, which is government spending and taxation, the idea is to smooth the business cycle. I mentioned that a little bit. You don't necessarily, obviously, when we want to avoid recessions, but when we think about excessive growth, there's also a lot of problems that come with that too. Think, for example, Montana has lived through the Bakken boom, and while 6% growth is really fantastic in some ways and leads to some wage growth and positive economic outcomes, it also brings with a lot of negative social outcomes and it's hard to keep up with public facilities. How do you provide fire services when you're growing that fast? Typically, there's some increased crime that comes in. And Montana's experience through the Bakken boom really explained why, in some ways, it's just nice to have a nice, steady growth path. We don't want our economy to grow too much, but we certainly want to avoid recessions as well. So that's what the goal is for fiscal stimulus, and government spending helps replace the money lost in a downturn. And you can do that with either higher spending or lower taxes. And then during expansions, you're supposed to pull back that. That stimulus also works best when you're stimulating the economy, putting the money in the hands of households who immediately spend that money actually results in the most amount of stimulus. So that is why, unemployment insurance benefits are so effective, is because it goes directly to households who they've lost some income, and typically people continue to spend whatever income level they were at before the recession. So the unemployment insurance benefits are immediately spent within our community. When money is directed towards businesses, for example, that can really help keep the business afloat, and that's important for our economy as well. But in terms of an immediate economic stimulus, sometimes it takes a little bit of time before that money filters down into households and helps drive demand. So that is one reason why the UI benefits have had such a large impact on our overall job growth. I mentioned that we are putting out additional unemployment insurance benefits in December. That payment is, I think, $200 additional. And we estimate that'll be about $16 million that's paid out. They have an multiplier effect of 1.9 is what it is for UI benefits. And that results in about 30 million of additional economic activity. We do have on our job tracking dashboard again, we have what has been distributed out to your county. So if you want to look at that from a more community perspective, that's available on our job tracking dashboard. We've paid out a lot of UI benefits in 2020. About 620 million of that, sorry, I forgot an M right there, comes from the federally funded programs. So that it has been a large infusion from the federal stimulus packages. Again, there's a lot of national debate about those, and you can have your own opinion about whether or not that would have, but as current law is, that would expire at the end of this year.
Hey, Barb, do you know what we paid out last year in UI benefits as a comparison for people that are listening?
I actually put that onto a spreadsheet so that we can talk about it. Our benefits of last year, I believe, were about 100 million.
Okay.
So I think that might be a little outdated in that number, but I mean, we're certainly tenfold to,
right,
more on that. So a lot of benefits that we paid out this year. In terms of other types of stimulus that has been discussed, one of the concerns that has been expressed nationally about the $1,200 direct payments that each household received, and then you received additional for children and whatnot. One of the concerns about that is that only about 40% of that direct stimulus was spent. The rest was saved. And as I said, what you want in a stimulus is for that money to be spent. While paying down debt or putting it in your savings account, that does help the household's financial position. It doesn't provide that immediate economic stimulus that is kind of the goal of why we're spending that money. So does it leave people better off? Yes. Does it make our economy recover more quickly? Not as much. So that's one of the concerns about that. The impact of the PPP funds, which are the business loans, I think have been very important to Montana's businesses this year. We talk a little bit about that in a later slide, but we don't really know yet what the impact is, partially because that program funding ends at this year, and then we're going to kind of see how many of those need to be paid back or don't get paid back, and that's still a little unclear how that's going to work out. So we don't know that. And then also the CARES Act provided some paid leave for particularly for parents who need to take some leave in order to care for their children, while I can tell you as a boss of someone who's had some of workers with daycare issues, that's been really important for me as a boss, but how wide that has in terms of economic impact, we don't know that yet, and we won't even know how much of that was utilized until the new tax data comes in, which will be October of next year. So, oh, and then the last thing I want to mention, boy, there's a lot of fiscal stimulus that has been going on. We did also this year put an infusion of $200 million into the UI trust fund. And you remember on the previous slide where I said that what you want to do during a recession is cut back on taxes or increase spending. What you don't want to do is increase taxes in the middle of a recovery. That would have a negative impact on the recession recovery. So I think the timing of this infusion of cash to prevent a tax increase was really important to allow Montana to continue their economic recovery. With this infusion of cash, our average tax rate for the UI trust fund will remain at the current rate of 1.12 instead of increasing up to the higher rate. That reduces taxes for employers of about $100 million next year, and then that grows a little bit the next 3 years. It's about $300 million. Kind of depends on your assumptions for that 3-year timeline. But I think the key point here is it's hard. You don't want to hit employers with a tax increase right as we're trying to recover. So the timing of this is particularly important.
Right. I want to touch on that just a little bit, Barb. So the UI Trust Fund, we had a really healthy balance in Montana at the beginning of this year, which set us up to weather some of these impacts from the pandemic. But the more we were watching it, the more we were concerned with what this was going to do in the future for businesses and employers as they were trying to deal with after effects of this year. So this infusion of dollars, like you said, will have a long-term impact and hopefully help them weather some of the other impacts that they're going to have to deal with going forward.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. And, Montana's UI Trust Fund is kind of set up with some automatic changes of tax rates in order to help keep our balance in a healthy level. And that was really important during the 2008 recession. We were one of the few states that didn't go into the red, right? And, that certainly was a worry this year because we had such a huge spike in claims. So this is important that we, it's a good government in terms of keeping our trust fund in a good, sound fiscal position, and it's good economic policy in terms of preventing a tax increase at the wrong time. Okay, so some of the other unemployment data, we've looked a lot about the total employment numbers in the labor force. We're continuing to track claims. This chart comes again from our job tracking dashboard, and shows the claims, the huge spike that we had in April. The top chart here shows initial claims, or the first week someone is claiming. And then the bottom chart here shows the total number of people who are filing a claim of any type that week. And we have had a nice steady decline in that. We have, just in the last month, you can see a little bit of an uptick past November in both of the initial and the continued claims. That was expected due to seasonality. We have actually been expecting this for a couple months now. We normally start to see claims start to increase right away in the fall. Maybe it's a little bit, we haven't had too many snowstorms yet in Montana, so I think that kept the construction workers at on the job longer, but also the decline and improvement in the economy has been enough to compensate for the increase in claims that we would have for seasonality. So we're finally starting to see a little bit of seasonality coming into their data, which is actually a little later and more muted than what I thought it would have been at this point in time. So that little bump up is actually positive news, even though it seems like bad news, but it is something that's actually delayed seasonality in the data.
Hey, Barb, do you want to go back to that?
Yep.
Just for reference for the people dialing in, last year at this time, we had about 1,700 initial claims. And for ongoing claims, it was closer to 10,000 as compared to the 25,000 that we're looking at. So still a lot of people that are being affected by the pandemic.
Yeah, the levels are still much higher than we want them to be, for sure. It is also true that we do see unemployment insurance claims are a very interesting indicator because they're one of the first we notice that there's a problem, but it also takes longer to come down than some of the other ones. And that is partially because there's so much churn in the economy that we don't really see when it comes to the unemployment rate or measuring total employment, because we're looking at this big macro number, right? Well, unemployment claims are counting individuals impacted, and that churns so much. Like nearly a quarter of our employment moves into a different job or quits or starts a job every quarter, and that's a normal economic time. So there's just so much more churn underlying the surface, and that's what keeps unemployment insurance claims from dropping quite as quickly as we see in like the employment and unemployment numbers. Kind of a wonky thing, but I am a little wonky, so there we go. A couple other, obviously GDP and personal income growth are important things for us to track as an economist. At this point in time, we don't have a lot of data for Montana. This chart shows the GDP on one side and the personal income growth on the other. United States is red, Montana is blue in both charts. And you can see the huge loss in GDP in the second quarter. We don't even have data for Montana yet, so it's just this data is so delayed, it's difficult to make it meaningful immediately. So that's one of the reasons why we don't have as large a focus on this. The GDP data will come in, I think we'll get third quarter at the end of this month for GDP and the beginning of next month for personal income. But personal income, there's a huge spike of personal income in the second quarter because that's when all the stimulus dollars came out. And so that in some ways, these two indicators typically move very closely together. But as we had a fall in GDP, we had a huge growth. So that's opposite of what normally happens in our personal income. But overall, we just need more time for that data to come, and then it'll be more interesting at that point. We are tracking a lot of alternative measures of data because of the delay in the data and the rapid speed of this recession and recovery. We have been, searching for all sorts of little data points that we can include, and some of them that are, particularly interesting as how our businesses have done. You would think initially we had a lot of businesses right away in April and this summer say that they were going out of business or closing down indefinitely. And we have seen a lot of those businesses not close down as originally expected, which I think is due to the PPP loans that are coming out. As of August, so this data is actually a little out of date, over 24,000 Montana businesses had received PPP loans to help them through the downturn. And I think that has been important to our state to keep the payroll jobs open and keep our growth potential up. That'll make a big difference as we continue this recovery. Bankruptcy is actually down by 31% from last year. I think that also is probably attributable to the PPP loans. Now, if that's true, we will see them spike a little bit. Like people have been able to delay a bankruptcy that was in the works. They would have been able to delay it with this infusion of cash. So we probably will see a little uptick next year on that, just this delaying the ones that would have occurred this year. So that is a good news for our economy as well. When we look at how many businesses have been registered with the Secretary of State's office, that is down a little bit, but this is also data through October. So once November and December get in there, we'll probably be almost even with what we were in 2019 in terms of business registrations. So in terms of business closures, what data we have available right now says that there hasn't been as much as we feared there, but we really don't have full data yet. So that's something we also are waiting for.
Yeah, I think that's such an interesting stat on the bankruptcies because it certainly wasn't what we anticipated. But I know nationwide it's fairly similar that the nationwide they're down 38% compared to last year. So it really will be interesting to see with the PPP ending, you know, what the impact of that is nationwide, but also specifically to Montana.
Yeah. We also have, as from our UI division, has said that they have had an increase in business registrations as well. So that through this year is about 10% higher than what they were running last year at this time. However, it's unclear whether or not that's Montana businesses that are registering within Montana, or if that is some remote workers that, you know, one person moves to Montana and then that out-of-state business registers with Montana UI. So that's also an interesting data point. But there's so many things that we could interpret it different ways. So it's going to be really interesting as we move forward to get better data on that. I just have a kind of review slide put in here because we covered a lot in the last few slides, and it's economic data, so I get excited, but sometimes other people aren't quite so excited. The takeaways from here is just that Montana's recovery has been a lot faster than the nation. We are doing well. In terms of job growth, we are slowing down, but we're also slowing down from a pretty unprecedented pace, and that still leaves us at a pace that is significantly faster than any other recession recovery that we've had. So we do expect it to slow a little further without the federal stimulus. There's some, who knows what's going to happen federally there. And then we do also have some remaining questions about parents, how many of those are not fully working full-time, which will be important as we continue to recover our economy next year. Another thing I really wanted to dive deep into is our wage growth in Montana, because it's a very positive indicator, and there's actually some surprising things going on with Montana's wage growth. I think a lot of people know this already, but Montana has had very rapid wage growth over the last 10 years. This is something Montana has been doing quite well in. Over the last 10 years, we're the 7th fastest growth among states, ending in 2019. And that wage growth is important because it helped us recover more quickly from the recession. Wage growth is also really important because wages are one of the ways in which general economic growth and GDP get distributed down to, like, you know, the common person. So it's the way that we distribute economic prosperity throughout our economy so that everyone benefits. And it's how we translate GDP into whether or not people can put food on their tables. So wages are a very important metric that we track at the Department of Labor. And one of the interesting things here is that the total wages paid in Montana continued to grow throughout this recession, which is kind of mind-boggling when you think about how many jobs that we have lost. But wages have continued to increase. So this blue line here is the total wages paid in Montana among payroll jobs. So if you took all of the wages paid by Montana employers and threw them in a great big pot, and we track how big that pot is, and the pot is expanding. So the red is a trend line, and you can see these most recent quarters, we're a little bit below trend, but we're still growing, and you know, you got to look back at the seasonal adjustments. So we are higher than we were this time last year, which is actually quite impressive, that we are still expanding total wages, even though, you know, I mentioned before we're down 19,000 jobs, payroll jobs still, but we continue to have some wages expanding. So looking at what industries that's coming from, now this looks at the second quarter of this year for total wages paid, which is our most recent data available, but kind of the worst part of the downturn. and then compared it to 2019, the same quarter. So during the worst part of our downturn, we still had wage growth, and it was coming mostly, like federal government had a fairly sizable, this is millions of dollars of wages paid at the bottom here. So they're about $30,000 million higher than they were at the same quarter in 2019. Of course, you remember that there was some federal government shutdowns that was in the first quarter of 2019 that was an impact, but the second quarter they should have been back to mostly even from that shutdown. So, but keep in mind that that could have been a little bit wonky with how that data played out. Business and professional services, that includes a lot of engineering firms, a lot of technology firms, things like administrative and waste services, janitorial firms. So a lot fit into that category. They have been growing really well. Financial activities, that includes both banking and real estate. Construction has added a lot of jobs. And then we have state and local government. Typically government is pretty stable. So that's a nice benefit for stabilization during our economy. And then, of course, leisure activities here, we're measuring total wages paid. So this does not suggest that the people who are working in leisure activities are getting lower wages. What it says is that there's so much job loss that occurred in the second quarter of this year that they are significantly down $80 million. But it's kind of surprising that these uppers are actually compensate for that lack of jobs, which is surprising. Mm-hmm. I also wanted to mention, we'll talk a little bit about this later, but the mining and utilities, we have had Colstrip also shut down in the first part of 2020, and we've had some losses in the coal mining and related industries. Those are, if this whole pandemic had not occurred, we would be talking about that as the big economic story of 2020. But, in some ways that impact has been, just completely blown out of the water by the pandemic effect. So that...
Yeah, Barbara, question on that. Where are school districts located? Are they local government, state government?
They are in local government. In
Okay.
fact, most of local government is school districts.
Okay, thank you.
I think something like 80%, but I'd have to double check on that.
Okay, thank you.
Looking a little bit, so I've been showing you some total wage growth from our data, which the most recent we have is the second quarter of 2020. And this chart shows that over the year wage growth. So this most recent quarter of 2020, quarter two, is comparing to the how much has wages expanded since the second quarter of 2019, same quarter last year. So we have had that positive growth, as I mentioned. The orange bars actually come from the Department of Revenue in wage withholding. And what that suggests is in the next couple of quarters that the Department of Labor hasn't fully gotten all the data for yet, but wage withholding continues to be expanding. So that's a positive sign as well. It does suggest that, as we continued in this pandemic, among the workers who are still working, their wages continue to grow. So that's a positive thing, particularly for our state budget, for the UI Trust Fund. It does mean that puts us in a lot better position. Like I said, you don't want to pull back spending or increase taxes while you're trying to recover from a recession. So those are positive things for our state budget overall. I have some arrows here so I don't forget to mention things. On a quarterly basis, we were down 27,000 jobs in the second quarter, and yet we still had our wages gain. And I still am mind blown on this little statistic. But part of what that comes from is that the wage growth has been so strong over the last year that we were able to compensate for those lack of jobs, right? So we saw the industries on the last chart, that wage gain was enough to compensate for the lack of jobs. And then the wages of jobs that have not been lost continue to grow, as we see in the next 2 quarters of 2020. So those are all positive signs. Some of that comes also, because most job losses occurred in this leisure and hospitality industry. And we will see this chart again later, so I'm not going to fully explain it. But this is an indexed payroll employment by industry. And this green bar is the leisure and hospitality industry, which includes things like restaurants, tourism, all the hardest hit things during this recession. And you can see that they went down to nearly 50% of their employment lost during the worst part of the recession. They're still at 90. It's not they have recovered significantly, but there's still a long way to go for this industry, certainly. And a lot of workers are in this industry are still without employment. But they also are fairly low average wages. So among those 27,000 jobs that we lost in Q2, most of them were pretty low wage, which also helped us continue to grow so it's the low wage jobs that ended up being lost. What that will result in is that our average wage in Montana is likely to continue to increase in 2020 despite this economic downturn. We've lost some of the low wage jobs. The high wage jobs continue to grow in terms of wages, and that'll cause our average to move up despite this economic downturn. So for those individuals who were able to continue working, it ended up being a pretty strong wage growth year for them, whereas those without, it becomes a recession recovery of those with jobs had a great year, they got some extra stimulus, they were able to refinance their mortgage, the stock market is doing well, your retirement looks good. So there's the haves, the ones with the job have actually been experiencing this recovery, and then you have the have-nots, and those are the individuals who likely don't have huge retirement savings because they've been in low-wage jobs, their jobs haven't come back, they probably haven't been able to refinance because they either don't own the home or they haven't, they didn't have a job, so you can't refinance during that period. So there really is this story of the haves and the haves not during the recession, which is, probably the most negative thing I will be able to express today in terms of my one hand or the other. This is the other hand. There's a lot of people out there who are still really suffering. So continuing that conversation about, the haves and the haves nots. This chart shows how many claims we've had by income quartile. So we take everybody who has made a claim during 2020, and we have different April, the worst month here, and then every other month we've shown. And then we break them into wage quartiles based on their previous wage level. And the yellow is those individuals who are below or in the lowest paid workers, and their average wages are less than about $26,000 a year. And the green is the highest paid workers in Montana. So, and the point of this chart is just to show again that these low wage workers are the ones who are most likely to have lost their jobs during this recession. The 25% of workers who are in the lowest wage quartile comprise 60% of the claims in April. And in October, they comprised 50% of the claims. So while we're still, they have certainly gone back to work, they're still representing a significantly large portion of the claims and not getting back to work as quickly as we would want them to be. Just looking at this exact same thing again, but this time we're going to look at the blue sections are the bottom 50% of workers. The gray section are the top 50% of workers. In April, the bottom 50% made up over 3/4 of the claims. They're still making up 71% of the claims. So definitely have been more impacted during this recession and have been less likely to come back with a job during the recovery. Typically, high wage and highly educated workers take longer to get reemployed. They tend to be more specialized, and there tends to be less job openings for these high paid jobs. So we typically see it being more difficult for the ones in gray to come back. The good news is we've seen a lot of these high wage workers come back more quickly than what we would have expected for normally. The bad news is we have not, it does seem that the lower waged workers are not coming back as quickly. A lot of that comes with the leisure and hospitality industry, and is certainly something that will create some long-term impacts of this recession. So kind of a summary slide here, low-wage workers were much more likely to become unemployed and unable to take advantage of some of the benefits we've had in this recovery, which includes the low mortgage rates, includes the gains in the stock market for our retirement funds. If you were able to keep working, if you're in the has, then you were able to experience those and have benefited from the recovery. We also, to mention again, women tend to be more disproportionately impacted during this recession. This small little chart comes from our jobs tracking dashboard and shows the share of our UI claims by gender, with males being blue and women being orange. I apologize, there's no legend on that chart. I'll add it later. Typically, men make up the most, like this is before 2020 starts right about here. Typically, men make up for the most of our unemployment insurance claimants. That's largely because of the construction industry being male-dominated and having seasonal unemployment claims during the winter months. But since COVID happened right here, this change, it has been pretty constant that women have been the larger share of claims until just recently, where we're getting a lot of construction claims coming in. But that is also because women tend to be a high share of workers in the leisure and hospitality industry, and actually in lower wage industries overall. So we certainly have some have-nots that are out there that we cannot ignore that fact as we're talking about how strong our recovery has been. It has been, and it's been good for a lot of our workers. There's still ones that have been left behind, though.
I'm just going to, a reminder, Barbara, we've got about 6 minutes left here.
Oh, geez. So. I've been talking too much.
No, it's great. I just a reminder on time. So you're
Oh, thank you. I'm sorry. It looks like we're not going to get to many questions, but I'm going to go through these last few slides really quickly. Again, this is just to show some industry impacts. Indexed employment to February. Leisure and hospitality, we're still down significantly. Zoom into that last chart to look at some other ones. Mining and logging, I mentioned already. This comes from some of the coal strip closures, not necessarily pandemic related. Business services, all of these are, at 94 or above coming back. Business services, manufacturing, and then other services. And then zoom in one more time, and the industries that we have that are most close to full recovery include trade, transportation and utilities, education, health service, and construction. Both of these are important industries, with healthcare and trade are very large industries, so it's important to see these come back in terms of employment levels. And then last, I think this is my last slide of just looking geographic distribution. The blue counties are ones that are 5% growth or more, which is very, very high. We rarely have people growing more than 5%. We have a couple counties in that category. The light blue is those that have been growing 1 to 5% growth. That's more like a normal rate of growth. This is over the year ending October. So there are some counties that have fully recovered from the recession and experienced employment growth of the last year. The gray counties are ones that are kind of just right around zero right now and have close to breaking even or slightly over break even. And then the red counties, the dark red is the worst off, and then the light red are counties that have just had some losses up to 5%. And you can see that there's still a lot of rural counties that have been impacted. At first, the urban counties were more impacted. Now we're starting to see larger impacts in the rural areas as COVID has spread into those areas. So I'm going to skip over this slide because it's mostly just restating what I've said already. We're going to have a lot of changes in our economy, but we're looking forward to a strong recovery and a continued strong recovery. But that doesn't mean that there's not going to be impacts that remain, particularly with some different income groups and childcare concerns. Done.
All right, good job.
Rush through those last few slides.
Nice job, Barb. I appreciate the information so much. Did you want to touch on again this website that you have listed, and also just a shout out to the research and analysis team that you work with? Do you want to dive into the information people can find here?
Yes, so our website here at lmi.mt.gov is our one-stop shop for all labor market information, and then you can find our job tracking dashboard, which is the recession-related one. We have a lot of great staff that work at the Department of Labor that have contributed both to this website and to the job tracking dashboard, including people from UI and IT helping us get that data so it can be updated instantly. So it's a great way to keep track of the recession. We also have some of the local counties pulling from data from that, so it is getting distributed and used in other websites as well. So check it out, and I hope if there's something you want or have questions about, I'm happy to answer them.